Hi, afternoon everyone, and welcome to another episode of our CSEC lecture series. My name is Alexis McDavid, and I am an outreach officer at the Institute of Jamaica, which is an agency of the Ministry of Culture. And the division I am a part of is the National Museum Jamaica Division, located at 10 to 16 East Street in downtown Kingston. And this virtual event we're doing today is a collaborative event between the Institute of Jamaica and the University of the West Indies History and Archaeology Department. So we just want to thank you for tuning in, and I'm going to now introduce our speaker. Michael Leon is a Spanish teacher at the Caribbean Maritime University, and he has taught Spanish for 5 years at CMU and offered private industry-based Spanish classes, and has worked as a translator-interpreter in various capacities. In addition to holding various certificates in Spanish, he also has a Master's of Philosophy in History. And his thesis looked at the historical relations between Jamaica and Cuba between 1959 and 1990. So we just want to thank Michael for joining us today. And his theme is theme 4 on the CSEC syllabus, which is Metropolitan Movement Towards Emancipation. And the topic he'll be discussing today is attitudes towards slavery, arguments of interest groups for and against slavery, economics, humanitarian, religious. So thank you, Michael, for being here. And
a pleasure.
Let's jump right in. So the first question is, what is a metropolitan nation?
Okay, now first and foremost, before we even begin to answer the question, we need to know what is a metropolitan nation. Now this refers to a country that owns colonies. So take, for example, Jamaica's metropole was once Great Britain and Cuba's metropole was once Spain. So therefore, when we're saying metropolitan movement towards emancipation, we're referring to actions taken within the metropolis itself, so within Great Britain or Spain. That's what we're focusing on. We're not focusing on activities within the colonies, but activities within the metropole itself.
Which metropoles are we going to analyze today?
Well, we're going to be analyzing Great Britain and Spain. Now, based on the map that you're seeing here, at this point in your career as a history student, you should have an idea as to which one is Spain, which one is Great Britain, which one is Jamaica, and which one is Cuba. Now, if you're not aware of this at this point in time in your career, then dog and your supper. So the two countries that we're going to be looking at are Great Britain and Spain, and we're going to be focusing on their emancipation within the Caribbean and the Americas.
Who had more slaves, the British or the Spaniards?
Well, money talks and everything else walks. Now, the British, numerically, they had more slaves. And this, of course, is due to the fact that they had invested heavily in agriculture. So sugar production, tobacco, so that was labor intensive. So as a result of that, they had to import in thousands upon thousands of slaves, as opposed to the Spaniards, who they focused on mining. So gold, silver, etc., etc. So that did not require heavy slaves. So in addition to that, they had millions of indigenous people who, unfortunately, millions of them died as a result of the Spanish conquest. But the fact still remains that they had an indigenous population within the Americas. Now, if we look at certain information here, now as students of history, you need to be providing sources and data. So, for example, according to Klein and Vincent, in the late 18th century, the Spanish West Indies had approximately 80,000 slaves, as opposed to the British, who had 467,000 slaves. And this is focusing on the West Indies. And we're looking at 18th century. So by this point in time, the Spanish West Indies was not heavily invested in the sugar industry as opposed to the British. Further on, Klein highlights that while Brazil was home to 1 million slaves and the United States housed approximately 575,000 slaves, mainland Spanish America had only 271,000 slaves. Now, if you look at the fact that the mainland colonies of Spain, which at that point in time were stretching from Texas all the way down to the tip of Chile, that's a massive piece of landmass. And for them to only have 271,000 slaves in that entire geographical landmass is something to really consider.
Who were the interest groups in the metropolis that were for and against slavery?
Okay, now the ones who were against slavery, this is the humanitarians and the religious groups, and also the industrial capitalists, and those who were for slavery, that is the lobby groups in government and the plantocracy. Now, before we advance, let's look at these two images that we're looking at here, because it's definitely indicative of the time. Now, the one on the left says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Now, this was the symbol of the humanitarian movement that was taking place. This was their symbol. And the image that we see on the right, it says, "To be sold and let by public auction on Monday, the 18th of May, 1929, under the trees for sale, slaves." And you see big and bold. And this is in 1829, and this is in Jamaica. So, if they're having these kind of publications in newspaper, and it really shows that this was just normal behavior. It's almost tantamount to your renting out your skills as, say, a day worker. Okay, so.
Who were the abolitionists in Great Britain?
All right, so the abolitionists in Great Britain, they were learned men, they were organizations, they were Christian groups, right? They had formed themselves into different bodies to fight against the institution of slavery within the government itself. Now, we can trace the beginning of this abolitionist movement to the early Quakers, the Christian movements, the Methodists, etc., etc. So if we look at the information that we have right here, we're seeing how the abolitionist movement began in the 1780s with the establishment of Quaker anti-slavery committees. Now, these committees, they were not very effective, unfortunately, in the colonies for obvious reasons, because the colonies, they depended on slaves. So these Quakers, they actually experienced oppression or repression from the planter class in Jamaica, to the point where some of them actually had to leave. Okay? Another important case that you have to remember as a history student is the Somerset case of 1772, which was presided by Lord Chief Justice William Mansfield. And the case was about James Somerset and his lawyer, Granville Sharp. Now, essentially what had happened in that situation is that James Somerset was a slave, and his master had brought him to England, and his master wanted to resell him elsewhere, which of course he did not want that for whatever reason. But long story short, the case was taken up by this young man here, Granville Sharp, to stop this from happening. And what Lord Mansfield had judged, that it was illegal to resell a slave in England, okay, to forcibly remove a slave from England. Now, this is very, very ironic, because the precedent stated that you cannot forcibly remove a slave from England. It did not abolish the system of slavery. What it did was that it questioned the institution itself, questioned the property, how we view the slaves, that they're not just property. Okay, question the ideology behind it. Now, as a matter of fact, slavery in England had withered away over the years. Okay, so this is what is so paramount, just so revolutionary, so to speak, about this case. So you have to remember this case as a history student. Christian movement, as the notes are showing there, there were Christian movements, educated men, MPs, members of parliament, and organizations who opposed the slave trade. As the name members of parliament suggests, they're in the government. Now, initially, they did not want outright abolition, just the amelioration of slave condition. As this is very, very interesting, because we're seeing how the abolitionist sentiment had changed over the years. They're trying to fit in to the ideology. So next, if you look at this quote here by Sir Thomas Buxton, emancipation was to be nothing rash, nothing rapid, nothing abrupt, nothing bearing any feature of violence. It will subside, it will decline, it will expire. It will, as it were, burn itself down into its socket and go out. We shall leave it gently to decay, slowly, silently, almost imperceptibly, to die away and to be forgotten. So the objective was for slavery to wither away. They didn't want this abrupt abolition. Now, the famous humanitarians who you have to remember, such as William Wilberforce, he represented Yorkshire, and he was a member of Parliament, and he was advocating against slavery in Parliament. There were different religious groups, as I had mentioned, such as Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, and Moravians. These humanitarians, they also worked with Granville Sharp and Thomas Buxton. So this is who the abolitionists were. So now, as the rest of the notes are shown here, this is some basic data on the most important abolitionists that as students you need to remember. So for example, William Pitt, he was the Prime Minister of Britain, and he was a very close friend of Wilberforce. And he would support Wilberforce in the Parliament against the slave trade. Now, what is very, very ironic about this, is that the French historian, as we're seeing here on the notes, Gaston Martin, accuses Pitt's humanitarianism to abolish the slave trade as an attempt to undermine France's economy, because they knew at that point in time that the production of sugar required slaves. So what he is postulating is that the only reason why they opposed the slave trade because they wanted to see the economic system of French colonies collapse, which were dependent upon slaves. So as we're going along in the lecture series, we're going to be highlighting the hypocrisy of the humanitarian movement. Now, ironically, the slave trade under the Pitt government had increased. So this is why historians such as Eric Williams, who we're going to be discussing, is questioning the validity of the humanitarians. How effective were they? Another famous one, Thomas Clarkson, he wrote a book called A Some Review of the Slave Trade and the Probable Consequences of Abolition. He was an academic. He did lots of research on the slave trade, looked at the conditions of it. He went on the slave ships, so he saw how they were transporting the slaves across from Africa to the New World, and he wrote articles in opposition to it. He worked with Wilberforce, as stated, and he was also a member of Parliament.
What were the organizations that opposed slavery in Britain?
Okay, so you had various organizations that had emerged. Okay, now some of the most important ones are listed here. For example, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, formed in 1787 by Wilberforce. Other one is the Clapland sect, which was mockingly labeled the Saints by other MPs due to their Christian beliefs, and they were opposed to the slave trade, and of course, slavery and racism was just the norm. So then for you to come out and say, no, black man equal to white man, give black man in freedom, X, Y, and Z, he like them and look upon them and say, but the man are some saint. You're going against what is the norm. So it was a mocking term, mocking label given to them. Members were wealthy Anglicans who opposed slavery, and they were members of Parliament. Other societies that you have to mention would be, for example, the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British domains, 1823. Now, as historians, you have to be looking at the date itself. 1823, amelioration. So this society was formed for the gradual abolition of slavery. Okay? Now, to further question the humanity of these humanitarians, it is ironic that on 3 occasions, the Abolition Committee had denied any intention of emancipating the slaves. Now, when you're seeing evidence like this in the documents, you have to question it. You have to question their validity. How humane were they? And this is what Eric Williams was doing. And this is what you need to be doing as history students.
How did humanitarian agitation influence emancipation?
Well, what they did is that they lobbied in Parliament to abolish the slave trade on humanitarian grounds. And of course, when you're doing this, you have to be critical, to put it in quotation marks, on humanitarian ground. So they lobbied in Parliament, they wrote books, they wrote articles, they got people incensed, so to speak, to be against the slave trade and the institution of slavery. So some of the other acts or dates, that you have to remember is 1807, abolition of the slave trade, the Amelioration Act, 1823, right? And also you have to highlight the fact that these abolitionists were members of Parliament, so they're able to influence public opinion and the government's opinion and the policy that they would have taken towards slavery.
How effective was the abolitionist movement in the Cortes of Cadiz?
All right, so first and foremost, let us understand what is the Cortes of Cadiz. Now, this was the Spanish government that was in power during the French occupation. So they're the ones who organized the resistance to the French occupation. Okay, remember the French invaded in 1808, and it was Charles IV. Charles IV was the king at this point in time, and when he was removed from power by Napoleon, those Spaniards who remained, they created what they call the Cortes of Cadiz. Now the question was, how effective was the abolitionist movement in the Cortes of Cadiz? Now, first and foremost, as was stated earlier on, there was not much investment in the sugar industry by the Spaniards. So because of that, there was not any need to have this large influx of slaves. And on top of that, the Spanish system of slavery was a lot more, quote unquote, humane. Okay? And throughout the years, that adopted different policies to ameliorate the system in which slaves had lived. Okay, so as the notes are saying there, slavery in the Spanish colonies was minimum, and also the Haitian rebellion, or the Haitian revolution, it had silenced any opposition to slavery because people had it in their mind that we do not want to end up like Haiti, so they were doing their best to mitigate that from happening. Okay, so what is very ironic about this abolitionist movement in Spain is that even the Catholic Church did not voice any opposition to the slave trade within Spain, even though the Catholic Church was very, very powerful. Now, they did not renounce the slave trade until 1839. So this really brings into question that, okay, how humane were you as Catholics? Now, unlike their British counterpart, they did not wield as much influence in the Spanish government due to the fact that the Spanish economic policy at that point in time favored the Cuban planters. Because they knew that, okay, if they were supposed to instill any laws or support any movement to abolish the slave trade, it's going to lead to insurrection in Cuba. And of course, at this point in time, they were dealing with the revolutions in Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, etc., etc., etc. So, they did not want to really upset the plantocracy in Cuba. So that is the reason why they had actually implemented regulations that had governed the treatment of slaves in the Spanish Empire. So as a result of that, it was more humane, quote unquote.
How did Great Britain influence Spanish abolition?
I know the way in which they did it is that they applied political pressure on the Spanish government to the point that they had abolished, that the Spanish government, as a result of pressure from the British, abolished the slave trade in 1818. Also, as the notes are showing here, Puerto Rican landowners could not afford the high prices of slaves after the treaty with Britain because the productivity of the island couldn't facilitate it. So basically, the sugar growers in Puerto Rico, they were not as rich as the sugar growers in Cuba. Okay, and because the trade was illegal, they could not afford the high prices of the slaves. Cuban planters had actually imported slaves from Puerto Rico. So that really goes to show how minimum there was slaves, how little bit of slaves there were in Puerto Rico. However, British complaints led to the prohibitory decree in 1848 and later in 1854, which reduced the slaves significantly. So we're seeing how Britain had an impact on Spanish policy towards the slave trade. Now, just a little anecdote here. You can look at the information which I have on the slide, which is showing that the slave population in Puerto Rico was generally small. So if you can see the numbers there, you can see the numbers and you can come to your conclusion from there.
When did the abolition of slavery in Spanish possessions begin?
Now, the abolition of slavery in the Spanish possession, we can trace it all the way back to, say, the early 1500s, in which we have a very, very famous Dominican friar by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas. And if we're looking at his quote, look at his quote, and he says, "What we committed in the Indies stands out among the most unpardonable offenses ever committed against God and mankind. And this trade in Indian slaves as one of the most unjust, evil, and cruel among them. So we're seeing how the Spanish opposition to slavery began from the earliest period of colonization, but this was in reference to the Indians. Okay, so the Spanish abolitionist movement began with their friars, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, etc., etc. So if you want to put a date to it, that's when you can put it. And of course, you have to put a character, which from the notes we're having them there. Now you also have very other influential Dominicans right there. We don't have to go through them in detail. You guys have these notes, so you guys can study this on your own. So, but the important of this is just to show that Spanish abolition to slavery began with Indian abolition.
Was there an abolitionist movement in the Spanish Cortes?
Yes, as a matter of fact, they were. You had various abolitionists who were actually in the Cortes itself. We're going to go through a few of the characters. But before we move forward, let's look at this image that we have right here. This should give you an idea of the structure of the Cortes there. Now, at some point in time, you can probably pause the video, screenshot it, and zoom in on the different images that you see here. You see army officers there on the right-hand side. As you go along, you see men in black. Those are the friars. You see men on the left-hand side in the white tights and what have you know. Those are politicians. So that's to give an idea of the makeup. And of course, you see the king at the top. Now let's look at some of these abolitionists here. Now we don't have to go through them in detail. You guys have these notes, but these are some of the most important names. So one of them is Isidoro de Antillon. Now I know a lot of you are going to pronounce it as Antillon. Do not say Antillon. That is bad pronunciation. Isidoro de Antillon. Okay, so he read his pioneering speech in the Academia Matritense of Law in 1802, echoing French and English abolitionist sources. So we're seeing how these abolitionists, they were aligning themselves with abolitionist movement in Britain. So they were basically reflecting it. Isidore, he worked with other abolitionists such as Joseph Blanco Wright. We'll look at him soon. And he wrote articles in the Spanish government's official newspaper, the Seminario Patriótico, the Patriotic Seminar, before Blanco went into exile in 1810. Okay. He also wrote Disertación sobre el origen de la esclavitud de los negros, which means dissertation about the origin of Negro slavery. And he focused on how to free the slaves and to end the slave trade. So himself and other Spanish abolitionists, what they were saying is that Spain should rely on the indigenous population, which had grown considerably in the 18th century. So if you look at it from a 21st century perspective, like they're saying, eat what we grow, grow what we eat. So what the man is basically saying is that we don't have the population. Where are their people, right? So just treat them better. We don't need to import all these different slaves. That's what he's saying. Cut from an economic standpoint, you want to cut back on your imports. Okay, so his perspective was that security against slave revolts was not the reason why he opposed slavery. So it had nothing to do with his fear of slave revolts, but he believed that Spain should make use of its own indigenous labor force. And he proposed gradual abolition of slavery. Now, as you're speaking about these Spanish abolitionists, you have to make sure that you're showing the comparison between the British abolitionists and the Spanish abolitionists to show that there was some correlation there. They're mirroring each other. Now, let's look at some of the things that he had stated. Isidore, he said, there can be no doubt the blacks will one day find a valiant leader who will avenge them and ensure their independence through force. And we must fear that finding the Crassus to this new Spartacus will not be easy. Now, for those of you who know these individuals, Crassus and Spartacus, these are individuals from Roman times, and Spartacus, he was a slave who was fighting against Rome and enslavement, and Crassus was the Roman general who was sent to defeat him. And he was saying that, boy, we don't have a Crassus, you know, but we have Corpus Spartacus. He also said, it is uncontestable that in our Americas, the Indians can take over the labor of the blacks, especially if they are treated with less harshness and arbitrariness. The message was clear. The prosperity and security of the Spanish Empire lay not in Africa, but in the Americas. Okay, so this is also one of the other humanitarians. Okay, you guys can definitely go through this here on your own. Okay, but let's just look at the quote. He said, one must keep in mind that no other European nation has had fewer slaves, considering the extension of its colonies, nor has any other based less of its prosperity on the labor of those unhappy beings than the Spanish nation. So what the man is basically saying is that even though we have one big piece of empire, remember, so the Manim Empire was stretching from Texas, Arizona, come all the way down. So comparatively speaking, that's significantly less, regardless of the fact that they had such a massive empire. And he also compared the Spanish slave trade in Africa to French occupation of Spain. So once again, you have to look at the time period in context, right? In context, because the French had invaded, and what he was saying is that them invade free land. How on the field? That's what the man was basically saying. All right. Now you guys can read this here. This is your notes. I've just highlighted the basic points for you. But let us look at one of his famous speeches, okay, which highlights his ideology. He says, do not forget that you have seen foreigners set foot in your homeland. Leave in peace that of others. Leave those unhappy Africans the scarce portion of goods that heaven has bestowed on their land. Leave them in peace so they can advance little by little along the road of civilization. Just because they are poor and ignorant, can you treat them worse than you would the beasts in the wilderness? They are poor and ignorant, but the same blood that runs in their veins runs in yours. The tears that their eyes shed are just like yours. Like you, their parents, children, and siblings, martyrs of Spanish patriotism. From this day forward, stop the Spaniards from going to the coast of Africa, where they surpass in cruelty and injustice those invaders that destroy your soul. You know what it is to have your families ripped from your homes by foreign soldiers. Leave to the father his children and to the husband his wife. He's making clear reference to the French invasion of Spain. Now you can zoom in a little bit more, when you're looking at writing from that period in time, because it gives an idea of how they were thinking, innit? Because he says, he refers to them as that they're ignorant. Africans. He says, just because they are poor and ignorant. So you're seeing the mentality of that point in time. So sometimes you have to remove your 21st century mindset when you're studying history and look at it through their lens. So as I said, you guys can read the notes on your own. Okay, so this is further notes for you here. These are other humanitarians who are very, very active in Spain. This man here is from Puerto Rico. He was in Madrid itself, right? And he was a member of the La Sociedad Abolicionista Española, okay, which is the Spanish Abolitionist Society. And also, very importantly, let's go back to that, is that among its original members was Segismundo de Moret. Now, this is a very important abolitionist within Spanish history. You need to know this man. Okay, so he was one of the architects of the Moret Law of 1870, and the Moret Law was passed in response to the 10-year war, the first war of independence, the 10-year war, which broke out in Cuba in 1868 and went up until 1878. And what this law basically states is that slaves who were born after 1868 were free, as well as those above the age of 60, and slaves who served in the Spanish army, slaves who were owned by Spain, and also the slave owners were compensated. But what you need to bear in mind as well, is that this topic of abolition emerged in Cuba as a result of the 10-year war, not as a result of humanitarian agitation in the Spanish government. So in 1868, Céspedes decided that, okay, Cuba, we want to be independent from Spain, and the revolution began in the eastern part of the island, right? And in order to win support, he told the slaves, if you fight for me, I will set you free. And of course, the Spanish government, they followed suit as well, because they did not want to lose Cuba, which at that point in time was a cash cow. They were earning billions of dollars for Spain. So there's no way they could allow the rebels to have the upper hand, okay? So what we're going to be seeing as we're going along is how the slaves themselves and the Cuban planters, right, had an impact on metropolitan policy as opposed to the British with other way around, right? You understand? So this is why you have to do the compare and contrast as historians as you're going forward, okay? Now, other important dates you have to look at, which is the Pact of Zanjón, right, which ended the 10-year war in 1878, and also La Guerra Chiquita, which means a small war in Spanish, which was in 1878-1880. Now, this war in 1879 to 1880, that was the death heel for slavery in Cuba. So we're seeing how at the end of this war, Spain just said, okay, wash your hands clean, abolish slavery. We're going to have a period of gradual abolition of slavery, they call it patrocinato. Okay, that's not for today's topic. We'll do that in another class.
In which country were they the most effective?
Well, based on what we have been discussing so far, we can categorically state that they were a lot more influential in Britain, right? Due to the fact that British economic policy favored the abolition of slavery. Let me say that again. They wielded more power in the British Parliament than their Spanish contemporaries due to the fact that British economic policy favored abolition. So in a nutshell, Britain was moving from an agricultural society to industrialization. And to add insult to injury, the West Indies, they were declining in economic value, which we will have some data further on in the class. So the economic goals of Great Britain was changing. They are moving from an agrarian society to an industrial society. So the man basically says there's no need for us to continue to support a system, right, which is only draining on us. And when we say a system, we're talking about the slave trade itself, okay? So let us tie the slave trade back to the economies of the islands, which is agriculture, sugar. At that point in time, these islands were in decline. They were in decline. They weren't making any money. Britain was becoming industrialized. So the man basically says, that now make no money. We're not investing that no more. Make a come out of that. This making money. Industrialization making money. Make a go in at that. Our islands, outdated equipment, not competitive. Saint-Domingue, a French island, more advanced technology, virgin soil, doing so much better. We cannot compete with them. Right? Let us now move away from the sale of sugar, and as such, we don't need to really support the labor system upon which the sale of sugar resides. Now, we're not talking about slave revolts. That is for a different class. So what the man was basically saying is, just set them free. Set them free, because if we keep them in slavery, they're going to rise up, but they're going to continue fighting, as was the case with Sam Sharp. But as I said, that's for a different class.
How did the Revolutionary Wars influence abolition?
Okay, now the Revolutionary Wars that we're zooming in at this point in time, based on the images that we're seeing there, are the Revolutionary Wars in South America. Now, the man at the top left-hand side, that is Simón Bolívar, the black man to his right, that is Pedro Camejo, and the image to the left-hand side, that's just a drawing, the fist of power, right there, that's the Venezuelan flag. And the picture on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Now, if you don't know where this is, once again, Dag Namyo Sopa. This is a statue of Simon Bolivar in Heroes Circle. So we're showing that the man was here. Okay, so the revolutionary wars in South America, they range from 1810 to 1823. Both sides used abolition as a means to win support. As I stated there, Bolivar was in Jamaica. The Spanish government, unwilling to stir up unrest amongst the Creole elite in Cuba, did not adopt an active abolitionist stance as was the case in Great Britain. Once again, they know, money talk, everything else can walk. Okay, they know the money I'm making at Cuba. They know. We don't have to deal with a revolution in a South American thing. Right? Let us keep them man, they pacified. They more slaves, all right, fine. We could work with it. We now adopt an active abolitionist stance. Now, one of the interesting characters from this period of emancipation came from Venezuela, which is where my family is from. His name is Pedro Camejo. He's known as El Negro Primero, which means the first Negro. And the basis that he's always the first man in battle. So that's what he was called by his friends. And he unfortunately died at the Battle of Carabobo in 1821. And legend has it that his last words were, "Mi general, vengo a decirle adiós porque estoy muerto," which means, "My general, I have come to tell you goodbye because I am dead." Now this man, as you can clearly see, he was a black man, and he fought initially with the royalists because the royalists were promising emancipation. Okay, and of course, he switched sides after that and went to fight with the patriots because they were more anti-slavery, the patriots, Simon Bolivar. But these are very interesting characters that you guys can look up in your study of history.
Who were the industrialists and the capitalists?
Okay, now these were men such as Joshua Wedgwood, right, who was the leader in the industrialization of the manufacture of pottery. So these are men who were really invested in the new means of production, such as factories. Okay, so these men hold lots of power. They were the Azans, the Mafus, the Issads, the stewards of their day, right? So we see the influence that they have over our society. Back then, it would have been a lot more. Okay, so these men would have wanted more funding and more support from the British government. So they would have aligned themselves with the humanitarians for the purpose of getting more economic support from the British government. So as we go along in our lesson, and we're learning about historians such as Eric Williams, we're going to see how abolition of slavery within the British West Indies was more economic than anything else. It has nothing, well, personally, I don't think it had anything to do with any humanitarian sentiment. I think it was just money, end of the day. Okay, so he was friends with Thomas Clarkson, British abolitionist. You guys saw him in your notes, and he produced the emblem of the anti-slavery campaign in 1787 at his factory, which is right there. The emblem is at the bottom right-hand side, and that is his factory on the left-hand side.
Who advocated on behalf of the British planters in the British government regarding slavery?
Okay, now that was the West India interest and the plantocracy. So essentially, they were a lobby group, right, within the British Parliament, and they were composed of businessmen, they were composed of MPs, okay, and they represented the interests of the plantocracy within the British Parliament. So any act or law that was passed that was unfavorable to the British planters and their socio-economic system in the colonies, once that raised in a parliament, the man was saying, no, we're not dealing with that. Okay, so you can just imagine the level of influence that they would have had in the government itself. But let's look at some more of the notes that we have here. Okay, it was a lobby group in the British Parliament. It evolved from an informal group. Now, this informal group were like agents who were sent by the colonies to represent their interests. Planters who send representatives to England to represent me, agents. So a man just say, yo, brother, go make sure my thing organized in England. This is not to say that every agent was an MP. Cool? Okay. Now, as I stated, they represented the interests of the West Indian plantocracy, and some of these island agents, merchant and absentee planters were also members of parliament, such as the Barbadian, Sir Robert Danvers in 1699. So once again, as historians, it's good when you bring up characters, bring up people's names. You know, it adds color and life to the topic. Okay, so they had members in the lower house and the House of Lords. So you can just imagine, you have these people who are representing the planters. And the planters say, your brother, me give you a thing, you know. Just make sure say you favor my cause in the parliament. So you just kind of imagine the level of influence that they had. Now let's look, now you have some more notes right here. You guys can zoom in that on your own because we now have an understanding as to what the West India interest is. Now according to Barry Hickman, now when you're writing, you have to know how to write like that as well. You have to know how to say stuff like that. So I can give a quote. According to Barry Hickman, the West India interest was never more than an ad hoc parliamentary grouping which possessed no coherence in a broader context, the economic hardships brought on by the loss of the 13 colonies, the fair slave rebellion, such as the plot uncovered in 1776 in Hanover, Jamaica, and French entry into the Revolutionary War in 1778, initiated a period of sustained lobbying which would transform the West India interest into a more professional and structured body. So circumstances. As Buju says, circumstances make me who I am, right? So circumstances is what had facilitated the development of the West India interest. So them say, well, go and say, boy, here, well, lose America, you know? So we need to come together and really protect for our interests, right? And we see what going on here, we see this abolitionist movement, so we link. Okay, so that's what it essentially is. Okay, now, you guys can go through this on your own. Okay. Now, some of the important names which you can mention is Stephen Fuller. He was an island agent, and his brother Rose was also an MP. Okay. So he's an island agent. You're an island agent, and your brother work in a parliament. Just do the maths. Do the maths. Okay. This is further information there. It should be noted, however, that the power of any lobby group is tied to a government that is already predisposed to act in its favor. So these abolitionists, them come out and say, oh, slavery wrong, X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z. Abolish slavery. But the British government done a match that already. The British government done a match out, say, boy, we could invest somewhere else. We could start invest in Asia, you know, they must invest in India heavily, China. So the man must say, well, the West Indies are collapsed, they now make no money. We have a bag of slave at a revolt. So the man them don't predispose for work with you as a lobby group. You understand? So this is how you need to be analyzing the data as historians. Okay, but again, you guys have your notes, you can read through it on your own.
Did the Cuban planters influence abolition in Spain?
Well, of course, based on what we have been discussing thus far, yes, because Cuba entered the sugar the sugar trade, or the sugar sale later on. So of course, they would have influenced, a lot of influence in the Spanish government, just like the Jamaican counterparts back in the day. Okay? However, the Spanish government was in no position to negotiate with the planters because their continental colonies were in revolt. So let's look at some examples in which the Cuban planters influenced abolition in Spain. So in 1789, Cuban planters were granted the right to import slaves from anyone, not just the Spanish negrero, who extracted high prices because he bought his slaves from British middlemen. Now, Spain, they were not heavily invested in the slave trade. So they never had as many, or if any, slave forts along the west coast of Africa. So basically, they must buy from him and then isolate to him. And of course, I have to put my little marker on it. Okay? On August 15th, 1818, Hacendados given the right to clear land for deforestation. Okay? Also, free trade law was passed on February 10th, 1818, which gave the Hacendados in Cuba the right to free trade. They can buy and sell to anyone. Now, this was done as a result of pressure from the Cuban plant. And of course, the Spanish government just said, well, We can't stop the illegal trade. Illegal trade is going on. Might as well make a money off it. We might as well make a money off it, right? So they regulated it. Also, the Cuban ranchers, in response to this humanitarian agitation, presented their protest via representación de La Habana a las Cortes, which means submission by the city of Havana to the Cortes on July 20th, 1811. This petition was skillfully drawn by Francisco de Arango y Parreño in 1811. So they had their own people who were supporting them in the government. The Cortes took no specific measures against the slave trade, nor did the 1812 Constitution register the abolition of the trade due to Cuban pressure and the threat of greater unrest. So once again, the Cuban planters are saying, look, we need slaves. We need slaves for grow sugar. If you're not giving away slaves, if you pass any law that are going to mess with my interests, we are going to rise up in a rebellion. You want that? And of course, the Spanish government, as I stated earlier on, they were in no position to negotiate.
What were the economic factors that led to abolition?
Well, based on what we've been discussing right about now, so far, money, economics, money talk, everything else can walk. British West Indies was not making any money. Sale of sugar was going down. Too much competition, virgin soil, outdated technology, and to add insult to injury, constant social unrest, which was, of course, the icing on the cake was some sharp, but we're not going to get into that. Okay, but it boils down to economics. Total Brit. Now, if we look at some of the data which we have right here, we're seeing how Jamaica, for example, was taking less of British imports. So, for example, British exports in 1821 was 43 million pounds. In 1832, it was 65 million pounds. Europe took half in both years. So we're seeing which market is taking precedence. Which market is taking precedence. We've seen how the East Indies and China, they took 112, but then by 1821, they took 112, and then by 1832, they took 1/10. Of course, this is reflecting on the fact that Britain was more interested in Asia at this point in time. So we're seeing a shift in the economic objectives. And exports to all islands declined by 1/5. So once again, numbers don't lie, people do. So the numbers are showing less importance, no need to continue to support this labor system. And of course, we've shown how exports to Jamaica had declined by 1/3. Now, what we can conclude is that mercantilism, which is a system of government which Britain had implemented for a period of time before free trade, advocated by Adam Smith, mercantilism had run its course, done and over with. It was necessary only to give political expression to the new economic situation, which is Reformation in 1832, which is the restructuring of the British Parliament, which would have favored the industrialists. So this is why I'm saying it was only to give political expression to the new economic situation. And what you guys need to look up is Reformation, restructuring of British Parliament, which gave more seats to the industrial capitalists, less seats to the West India interest. Okay, these industrial capitalists ultimately would have voted against slavery, have it abolished for the sole purpose of they themselves acquiring more funding for their enterprises. So it boils down to money.
How did industrialization affect abolition?
Okay, well, based on what we've been saying so far, boils down to money. Industrialization is a more profitable means of production, makes more money. So thus, British government would now start to invest more in the development of factories, which is a more efficient means of production. So no need to continue pumping millions and millions of pounds to sustain the West Indies. So it boils down to economics. By the 1780s, the sugar colonies and their slave economies were now seen as irrelevant to the economic growth in the metropole. And we're seeing the emergence of theorists such as Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, which showed that free trade was more profitable and that the colonies were an economic burden. Now, once again, you guys have to be mentioning your historians. You cannot just be writing so and so, so and so without saying who said what. Now, the person's name who you have to mention, we're talking about economics being the reason why slavery ended, is Eric Williams. Now, what he did was that he made the connection between a decline in the economic viability of the West Indies and emancipation. Emancipation was driven by economic consideration as opposed to humanitarian agitation. Now, once again, let's look at our numbers. Between 1772 and 1778, Liverpool slave traders lost 700,000 pounds. 700,000 pounds in the slave trade. And by 1778, 12 companies which had supported the trade had gone bankrupt. Money talk. Rise of industrial capitalism led to changes in Britain's economic system, which affected the relationship between Britain and her colonies. So you have to mention Eric Williams. Also, you have to mention Franklin Knight, who stated that slavery represented one form of coerced labor organization. Its viability depended on the degree to which its competitive remained feasible. It's no longer competitive, so that is why they abolished it. In a nutshell, advocates of East India sugar attacked the monopoly held by West Indian planters. Now, this monopoly that we're talking about is the monopoly to trade into the British market. So these East Indian planters were opposed to it. They wanted that monopoly, which the West Indian planters had, to be removed. Now, as we discuss and as we look at the history a lot more, we're going to start to ask some questions like, that's interesting. So they had referred to the West Indies as an eternal sponge on the capital of this country, both national and commercial. By 1812, it was estimated that the West Indian monopoly cost the British people annually more than 1.5 million pounds. So once again, money talk, right? If it's costing us money to support this system, it makes no sense we continue to support it. That is the argument in a nutshell. Okay, so this is further information there for you, which you guys would need to cite. Okay, so you can cite your theorist, Lowell Ragatz. There's his book right there. J.R. Ward, he's giving you figures, which is discussing the profitability of it. Also, you need to mention Seymour Drescher, which he wrote a book called Econocide, because you have to look at the other side of the coin as well. So even though for this lecture we're focusing on the economic side of it, as to why they abolished slavery, look at the other side as well. The theorist, the historian which you have to mention is Seymour Drescher in his book Econocide. And what he was saying is that the West Indies were not in decline, but they were growing economically. So what he's basically saying is that England, they were altruistic in the abolition of the slave trade, that from the goodness of their heart, they abolished slavery. But this is why as historians, we have to study the data presented, even by our colleagues. And this is what Elsa Gavaya did. She found lots of contradiction in Drescher's interpretation, and she realized that he was just picking and choosing from the data that was presented to him, just to support the notion that, oh, it's because of humanitarian agitation. So as historians, we have to be very, very analytical in what we're studying. You can also look at the information there about William Cunningham.
Yes, you can tell us a little bit more about the sugar economy in Cuba?
Certainly. So Rebecca Scott, she did her study on abolition in Cuba. And what she was basically saying is that new technology and new techniques was not a